Hi, this is Dr. Nick. I'm the incrementalist here with better business and better health ideas.
And I'm Fred Goldstein with Accountable Health, and I'm working on helping employers improve the health of their employees. So let's start today, Nick. There's been more health information coming out, particularly this issue of clotting. Can you discuss that a bit?
Yeah, so this is actually, from my perspective, I think very exciting. It was a paper published, or it may even be pre-published, out of Mount Sinai in New York. Large cohort of patients. They looked at the results of providing anticoagulation on patients that have been admitted to the hospital. And there were essentially two groups. It was those that were in intensive care, so they may or may not have had ventilation, but certainly required intensive therapy, and those that were in hospital that maybe weren't in intensive care, but certainly need hospitalization. So seriously ill patients. And they anticoagulated. For those that don't understand, that's thinning the blood. We do that in hospital with intravenous therapy or sometimes injections. When you go out of the hospital, people will reconcile that with warfarin. That's typically the drug that's used, although there are plenty of others. But here's what's exciting. It reduced the mortality rate in those patients by 50%. That's really impressive. That's such a great success in terms of a treatment profile in both the ICU patients and non-ICU patients. Fantastic news. Obviously more to do, but that's good news all around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. And, we keep looking for ideas. We find new ways that the virus impacts people. I understand also that one of the things you've been looking into is some new database from NHS.
Yeah, so the NHS, unlike the United States, is a single system. No politics-free zone here, to be clear, not advocating, but that's a database. And they've just published a huge trench of data that they're collecting naturally as part of the process of treating patients that are coming through what is essentially a single system. That's very good news from a research standpoint. We can apply all sorts of technologies, database analytics. We'll clearly need to do some natural language processing because I imagine there's some text-based content, but the opportunity to really dive into that and start to see what else we can understand. And importantly, why are some people getting really sick and others not? And can we identify them early so that we can head that off at the pass? Now, Fred, you and I have sort of talked a little bit about this over the course of the week, and there's been a number of videos that are coming out looking at school children and education, and there are different approaches to this. Tell us what you've seen.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. Obviously, everybody's worried. Schools, we're trying to figure out how to get them back, how to make it safe. I know the CDC has been looking at releasing some guidelines around reopening some of these various activities. And you can think about schools. You've got this amazing issue of a lot of people congregating together. Young children, they tend to spread disease, touch a lot of stuff. And then you're mixing them with elderly individuals, their teachers, the janitors, the housekeepers who are there, who obviously may or may not be at a higher risk than the children. And so some countries have started to reopen their schools. The Dutch, interestingly enough, are doing that. They've been sort of fairly open, have been aggressive about how they've been working with this virus. And they've actually created these plexiglass or plastic or glass fronts that surround the desk on the front and the two sides. And the students are in the classrooms, they're spaced apart. And we'll see how that is linked with other ideas, like what happens when they leave that classroom? How do they come into the classroom? All of those things are impacted. And then there was a fascinating thing I saw on Twitter of what the Chinese are doing in some of their schools, where the children come up, they remove their mask and drop it in a trash can. They then get their shoes sprayed to remove virus apparently from their shoes. They go into the next location and have something that their body is exposed to, put their hands into what looks like a UV light, a very organized process to go into schools. Now, obviously, some people might look at that and go, oh my gosh, is that what schools are coming to? But we don't know. We sort of need to think about this. What is the best approach to reopen schools and keep everybody safe?
Yeah, and I think the big difference between those two approaches, and neither is right or wrong. I don't think that's the point here, but you've got to be thoughtful about it. What occurs to me about the perspex or plexiglass, as I think it's called in the US, is wow, what a huge engineering feat to put all of this stuff up. And then the cost associated with that, that's almost feels unsustainable unless you've really got, you know, infrastructure to be able to do that. The Chinese experience, interesting. And I think what was notable was it was very young children. They had a sort of sequence, so they prepared it. And they've been very thoughtful about each of the elements to show. But is that what we're going to see in workplaces? Are we going to see that whole sequence as you come into a workplace, do you think?
That's a great point. It might actually be some way to do that and say, hey, we're gonna create this environment that we know once you've crossed the threshold, we've created a safer environment, or as safe as is possible given the situation. And so I think all of these ideas, obviously there are some cultural issues with some of it that people need to consider, but at the end of the day, if that makes parents potentially feel much more comfortable about their children going to school, it may have a really big impact on allowing certain schools to reopen, because we have to look at it not only from the issue of the child there, but the parent who's releasing that child to go into that environment. So I think there are some unique ideas, and we'll see.
And I think that's important because in that case, it's parents and their children, but that's the same for employers and their employees, and importantly, their visitors, because nobody's going to come to a business if they don't feel like folks are protecting them and have been thoughtful about this. And that's part of what we're trying to essentially pull together, is that guidance, right?
Absolutely, and putting that guidance together. And it'll also be interesting to see how that impacts, for example, restaurants, et cetera. If you have a younger audience, are they more likely to show up and stand and congregate outside than an older audience? And how do you create an environment where the person who may be much more hesitant to come in feels comfortable, and get that out to them? And those are all things we're addressing in our education programs and the work we're doing in the consulting we're offering out to companies.
Yeah. So essentially built into this is, you know, different strategies. I think the important thing relative to both of those concepts that you described is that on their own, they don't have as much impact, because what happens if somebody actually has the disease, and how do you try and prevent those folks? So this early identification and essentially self-isolation and quarantining is an essential component of that, not just in regular life, but also in business and education and all these different circumstances.
Absolutely. And as we get further along with this disease, we'll obviously learn much more and figure out how to begin doing better contact tracing, et cetera. Well, with
Right.
that, we'll call it another week, Nick. It's been fantastic talking with you. I'm Fred Goldstein with Accountable Health.
And I'm Dr. Nick. I'm the incrementalist, looking for better business and better health options.